that wasn't yet that you feel your book has now fulfilled? And this is sort of a free-for-all, so you just chime in. Yeah, go for it.
Great. So I will say that, for one thing, the opportunity to explore some of the issues relating masculinity and fatherhood was a big deal for me. Partly, like I said, because my partner has done so much work in the area of motherhood studies, and it was like, I think this stuff is really interesting, and I'd like the chance to have the chance to explore my side of the story. The other side of it is that what became apparent as we after we put out our call and as we started to look around, and I don't want to, well, it became apparent that it was difficult for us to find folks who were actually writing about fatherhood from the theoretical perspective that Nicole and I were interested in. And so what that told us, I think, and I want to hand this off to Nicole, if you can agree or refine this a bit, what that seemed to be telling us was that this was something that filled a really unique niche, that looking at fatherhood from a feminist perspective was not just a good idea, but was something that we couldn't find good concrete examples of folks writing about a lot of the parts of that topic that we were interested in.
I apologize. I'm going to step in here very, very quickly, Nicole, because as you pointed out, we were not recording. I did hit record now, but for those that may be watching this after the fact, I just wanted to tune in. And so the question that we're addressing right now is, what do you feel that Demeter books oftentimes address areas and subject matters that aren't frequently talked about. And so the books that we're discussing tonight, I think across the board accomplish that. And so asking the individual editors what they feel contributed specifically to this unfilled niche.
So yeah, I agree with Dan completely. We absolutely found that we were getting papers thrown at us that had anything at all to do with dads. I mean, just anything at all to do with dads. There was probably some excitement that there was something coming out on fathering. And so people were really trying to make their project fit. And I can think of a few cases where the word feminist had clearly just been kind of added into some other project in front of the word father, but it really wasn't really addressing the call. And so what we found and what we ended up telling our wonderful, I mean, we really, I can't say enough about the contributors, really came up with just amazing work. But the ones who stuck with us through the process and who ended up being in the book are there because they realized this work simply hasn't been done, and they were on the cutting edge of doing it. And so they had to define, I mean, each individual essay really had to set the parameters for what part of fathering and who is a father, what is fathering? And it seems like such a sensical question, but it really, really is not. It's a very complicated question. And so they had to define that term. They had to define how they were looking at feminism. They had, what feminist theory they were using. They had to think about, are we talking about dads being feminists? Are we talking about dads creating feminists? How does that work for sons? How does that work for daughters? How does that work when a child is maybe gender fluid, or if the father is trans? I mean, there were so many different iterations of feminism and fathering, and it simply hadn't been done. You go and you do a literature review based on your topic before you really begin. And this was one of those rare times. Not that people, I mean, of course, Andrea Doucette wrote our foreword, and she's wonderful, and she's done amazing work on fathering. It's not that work on fathering hadn't been done. It's that putting the feminism with it and really trying to come to grips with what does it mean to be a feminist father. I mean, I feel like I'm really tooting my own horn here, and Dan's as well, but honest to God, this stuff just wasn't out there before this.
It was surprising. It was surprising. You'd think that it would have been done, but we were having trouble finding folks who were writing on the topic. So it was that sort of drew us further into it. I think it allowed us to sort of gain momentum as we went and say like, oh, we're actually doing something, you know, worthwhile here. So that was really great.
It was.
I can relate to that very much, and I can relate to what Andrea said. A lot of my writing comes out of an extreme sense of irritation that something should have been written about already. And so I'm like, fine, I guess it's me. I have to do it. Okay. But as you said, maternal ambivalence, this topic had not been written about except by Rosika Parker was the one book that I found that had been written about this topic, and it had not been written at all about philosophically. And, you know, those of you who know philosophers writing about motherhood had been very rarely written about. At the time that I started my research in about 2004, my response was to the field of ethics and taking the way that philosophers had taken the mother-child relationship as an exemplar for ethics and thinking about what can we say about ethics if we look at this mother-child relationship. And it was essentially like, mothers care, it's a caring relationship. Isn't that wonderful? This is how people should be. And I had come from a background working in child therapy where the children that I worked with had been severely neglected and abused. And I'm thinking, I'm not so sure that this is how that works exactly, you know? So, and also I found it sort of offensive to thinking about the complexity of not only what the mother-child relationship is, but just intimate relationships in general. They're far more complex. And so I went into my dissertation work in my first book, which is on maternal ambivalence. And I said, I felt like, you know, this is an interesting example for ethics, but not because mothers necessarily care for their children, but because it's such an intense relationship. There's so much motive and opportunity to do harm, and oftentimes mothers don't do harm. And so my question going into the question of maternal ambivalence is, why don't they do harm? And then let's look at that as a question of ethics, because you have this extreme vulnerability, you have these extreme demands in a situation in which there's little social support. And then if you look at women who are marginalized, impoverished, dealing with racism, you have even more intense situations. And the book, the authors in the anthology look at so many different circumstances in which mothers find themselves and different aspects of those circumstances, how it manifests and what sort of reactions they have and what different sorts of circumstances. Rosanna talked about the context makes a massive difference in people's experiences and their responses to these kinds of things.
Oh, I guess I'm up next. So Patricia, my book is a little different because of course we're talking about a body part. We're talking about breasts. Not that it's a free-floating body part. These are not disembodied breasts. Really, part of the reason we looked at mothers' experiences of their breasts or their experiences of their breasts post-motherhood is that one of the huge things about breasts is probably the human body part that is the most medicalized. There's good research on this. It's wildly medicalized. Everything that's normal about breasts is somehow medicalized, from how they develop during puberty to breastfeeding. We hear a lot about breasts in our culture, either in advertisements, right? Used to sell stuff. This is not a secret. We hear a lot in our culture around breast cancer. Again, often used to sell stuff, sadly. And most women's, for most healthy women, their first encounters with the medical system, at least in most developed countries, is when they have their children. That doesn't stop with labor and delivery. That continues with the scrutiny of your breasts the whole time you're breastfeeding, or whether or not you breastfeed or you don't breastfeed, and it just goes on from there. It's also a part of the woman's body that is often very much publicly on display. So it's that part where women, there's a lot of ambivalence that's there as well. So we thought we wanted to look at breasts from the women's perspective, from the lived experience of being she with breasts. And we didn't want to just look at breastfeeding. There was so much on breastfeeding out there. We wanted to look at breasts from all angles. So we tried to do that.
Rosann,
Yeah.
your audio is having some trouble.
Is it? Oh, I might be a little far from the,
No, you're
part
coming
of
out,
it.
you're coming in and out, so you want to be either closer or just make sure your mic is securely
There.
attached.
I'm a little closer there. So I think that should work a bit better. There we
Only
go.
bring it up because I was starting to see people in the chat say, "Oh yeah, it's happening for me too." So I thought it was me.
Oh no, okay,
It might
okay.
be-
Sorry about that. Yeah, so basically we wanted to take the disembodied, medicalized, advertised, idolized breast and bring it back to the women who are experiencing their breasts. And we wanted the stories to come out, basically the stories that needed to be told. And the call for papers was very, very open. It was about mothering and breasts. And we got everything from art analyses of the nursing Madonna to very personal stories about HIV positive moms and the at times very cloak and dagger lengths that they went to for their right to breastfeed their children, to very personal stories about ideal bodies leading to death. So it was very, very interesting, the variety of stories that women needed to tell about their experiences with their breasts. And in there, we have the ones on breastfeeding as well. They're in there too, because again, that is part of women's experiences of their breasts. But it was nice to see it from the woman's perspective, not necessarily just from the health promotion or the medicalized or the advertised perspective.
Andrea, you had answered this before, but I think in the interest of time, if you could give a really quick recap of what you had said earlier in terms of why you thought this book was important, but also segue into our next question, which was also then open to everybody as well. And that is, what do you think your book complicated? Or, a lot of times, you look at some of these topics and you don't really understand. I think we've all been through this, particularly as undergrads, where you didn't realize just how complicated the topic was. You start kind of diving into it. So where did you find perhaps complications that you weren't expecting? Or what do you think, and maybe you think that those questions were answered or left unanswered in the books that you put out?
That's a great question. I think every editor struggles with that. I mean, just to recap, I mean, as Sarah said, I mean, the coming to this book was a place of anger and irritation. As a young mother myself, many, many years ago, and teaching young moms, I was just outraged about how young moms were represented. And it wasn't just that they were represented. Obviously, that's offensive, but I witnessed both my own life, but also with my young mom students, how so much that was internalized, right? That it's how do women not internalize that sort of absolutely harmful, derogatory representation of young moms. So it came from a place as a resistance. I saw this scholarship as activism, right? I really wanted to destabilize, interrupt that normative discourse. But in doing the book, and also our commitment was to really challenge that, that homogeneous view of young moms, right? That we talk about young moms sort of in this young mothers, right? Well, there's such diversity. First of all, in age, young moms are, the definition is up to 25. Well, being a 25-year-old young mom is going to be substantially different than being a 15-year-old mom. So we really wanted diversity, both in age. And we wanted diversity as much as possible across, as we always do as, editors, class, race, geographical location, sexuality. I'd say two things. I think the two powerful chapters in the book were, for me anyway, was queer young moms. Because I thought, well, nobody thinks young moms are queer because young moms are supposed to become young moms by accident, right? Unplanned teenage pregnancies. But we have a collection. She's actually a graduate student of mine and doing amazing work on young motherhood. But she, her area's on queer young moms who, knowingly and deliberately chose to get pregnant as young women. So that was just really new to me. We also had about a young woman who was not a mother herself, but was partnered with a trans man who had a child. And that how she was excluded from groups, as were the queer moms, because we assume even with young moms sort of this heteronormative, right? So you can't be queer if you're a young mom. And you certainly can't be a young mom who's not giving birth and be with a trans person. So, and a lot of these women talk about how they're excluded even from the few young mom programs out there. So that was really, it opened my eyes to the need to not make assumptions about young moms, that they've all given birth, that they're all straight. And I think all policies and programming assumes that, at least my research. But the other frustration is we didn't get as much diversity as we wanted. And I'm sure every editor can speak to that. We have one piece by an Indigenous young mom. We wanted more. We worked hard to get more. We didn't get it. And we didn't get enough representation. And I know that's a huge challenge of all editors, right? You don't want to use tokenism to say, okay, I can click that box. But at the same time, if you're talking about feminist fathers or breasts or young moms in my case, you really want as much diversity as problem. And I don't know if the other editors can speak to that, but as an editor, that's always been my biggest challenge, to get that diversity that has substance, not just tokenism. So I'll end there.
I would love to speak to that if that's okay, Katie.
Mm-hmm.
I think that part of the challenge there is that you want the diversity, but then marginalized people have been excluded from, these spaces. And so, even when you want to welcome somebody into a space of self-expression, like there's that legacy of exclusion and marginalization. And so then it just persists, and it's just, and it's, how to undo that when it's already so instantiated it's difficult at this stage.
There's a
But I
question.
think that the way that Demeter, the way that the calls are so open, and it's everything from poetry to visual art to academic articles, and all of it is taken seriously, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, creative, all of that is massive in undoing that kind of elitism in terms of what sort of knowledge matters. And I think that it's a really unique model when it comes to that. And I think that's, to me, one of the most important things about this press and the journal as well. It's extraordinary in terms of presses as far as that goes. And that's why I will always support this press.
It's a great point. It's one of the things that I remember Nicole and I spent a lot of time kind of agonizing over as we got further into it. I mean, Katie, your question about, where we went as editors as we explored the topic. And this is actually one of the questions that just came up in the Q&A, was about, would we do a sequel, or would we do further work on fathering in the COVID situation? To which my response was yes. And we would need to do a better job than we did on dealing with Black fathering and fathers of color more generally. I think those things matter, and we have to figure out how to do a better job with that subject, for sure.
What do you think, we're taking a little bit of a turn here, but I think it's an important one in terms of talking about, having the works that we read represent the communities in which we live, or at least aspire to live in. What did you feel was successful that you could maximize on, or other editors could maximize on, in terms of getting the diversity that you did accomplish in your books?
I want to go back to, I think what Sarah said is very true. The fact that it's interdisciplinary, and the fact that multiple genres are expected and respected is important, because I remember when Dan and I were very actively searching for just to make sure it wasn't all white women writing, which is what it mostly was at one point. And we were trying, white women mostly writing about pop culture dads was basically, so it was kind of like moves that we're used to seeing Mercy Demeter scholars make, but just doing it doing the same kinds of things, but with fathers. And so we really wanted to get more dads' voices. We wanted to, you know, have a wider representation of those dads. And so we were able to reach out. I mean, I remember Dan and I talking about, like, you know, I know this person, you know, maybe this person would be interested. And the fact that it didn't have to be a 20-page analytical, you know, article did make some of those voices a little easier to pull in. But I mean, as we've already said, it still falls far short of where I think we would like it to be. So one of the things that I want to say as an aspiring anti-racist advocate is any of us who have any positions of power in terms of hiring that are in academic spaces need to make sure that we hire people who don't look like this room looks right now. And because this is an ongoing problem. So who we're inviting to the table, I mean, what Sarah said is absolutely true. It's such a long history of exclusion that if we don't start somewhere to really invite people to the table in terms of jobs, we're going to continue to have this problem, I'm afraid. I really am, because it was the same problem. The Motherhood memoir collection suffered from exactly the same problem. So, you know, it's just, this is an ongoing issue for sure.
I'm going to jump in for one sec. I think Patricia and I were lucky in a way, although we definitely wanted more diversity. Oh, you guys can't hear me again. Can you hear me now? No? Yeah? Okay, excellent. I'm going to get really close to my screen. And maybe I'll turn the speaker up. Maybe this will help too. All right. So Patricia and I, though, we had the same issue with diversity. We really wanted more from the non-binary community. We really wanted more representation of women of color. We wanted more international representation. We would have liked that. In the end, we didn't get a ton of that. But what we did get in our personal narratives was we did get a number of women writing who were not academics and who had never written before. And those women, Patricia and I worked very closely with on the manuscripts. So a few of the manuscripts were pretty much unpublishable when we first got them, but we wanted those voices. So Patricia and I chose to work very closely with those authors, back and forth, working on fleshing out ideas, working on the editing, trying not to take away from the voice of the author, because we wanted to keep that authenticity. But there were a few areas where we did work very, very closely with the authors, and a few areas where English was not the first language. So we worked very closely with them as well. We could have rejected the manuscripts, but we chose not to do that. We figured it would be more work for us, but we wanted to get those voices in there. So we figured that was one way to do it. I don't think either of us had any idea how much work it was going to be and how hard it is to keep your voice out of there. We learned that very quickly. That's a huge challenge as well, to keep that initial voice and keep your voice out. Yeah, so we did try that. And I think it was pretty successful for the most part. Yeah, I'm going to jump out.
Andrea, did you want to chime in on that?
I would just reaffirm what everyone has said. I think one way, particularly for young mothers, was for us to have personal narratives. So we did have, I'm just going through it, I think we have 6 to 8 of young mothers themselves, right? Creative nonfiction, poetry, but as was just said, it also is a challenge too, because these are young women, and not judging them. When I was 18, I would have written like that, right? I mean, but it's also a scholarly press that goes out for review. See, this is the real tension, right? As a publisher and editor, we to get funding, right, which is very minimal, was just cut 50%. But the little we get, we have to be a scholarly review press, right? So we have to give evidence of that. But at the same time, we want to, open up for all kinds of voices, and many of those voices would not be published in mainstream journals or books. Not because what they're saying isn't spectacular, but because they haven't checked the boxes of what a scholar or academic looks like. So for us, we really encourage narratives, but we did have to do a lot of work as editors and be very careful to keep their voice, but to make it, I don't know what the word is, but to make sure it would that it was well written, but without taking away the rawness of their language, right? So it always is a tension, both as an editor but also as a publisher, because I got to send these things out for review. And I've had cases where people have come back and said this book isn't publishable because that's raw and unpolished, that piece. And I'm like, yeah, but it's still, that's okay, right? That's where the person is in their writing or their life. So it is challenging to balance the demands of the peer review process, right? And at the same time, welcome a wide diversity of voices from, and I'm not saying certain people can't write well, I'm just saying across the spectrum, activists, young people, practitioners, right, who may not speak in the language that academics want them to speak in, right? So, I've pushed back a couple times with reviewers and said, no, I want to keep the piece in as publisher. I think it's an important voice. It may not be to the standard of academic peer review, but I think it's probably better because of that, in my view, right? It's that authenticity that we're trying to get, but we have to work within the system, right? So I'm sure all editors, well, maybe not all editors, but I suspect a lot of editors struggle with that, to honor and preserve the authenticity and the rawness, and maybe the disjointedness of the writing, but that's the point, right? And I think that's what makes the writing important and beautiful, but some people may not agree. So I do think there's always that tension in editing and in writing.
As a small plug for the keynote address with the two women who will be joining us, we had a brief talk, trying to figure out how we wanted to approach the material. And a lot of what you were just saying, Andrea, I think will be present in that talk too, between activism and academia, and how those should be, in my opinion anyway, more synergistic, and yet oftentimes wind up not. And in fact, the opposite. And so that's a conversation that I'm hoping we'll be able to talk through a little bit more when we engage in that session. But for now, I wanted to make sure that other people had a chance to chime in. So we have a whole host of people with us that I'm hoping have lots of great questions, but if not, I have plenty more questions because I am fascinated by all the work that you're doing. One question has already come in, and that is from Joan, who says, and this is directed to Sarah, and I think probably other people can answer it, tweaked to your own subject matter. Says, Sarah, I'm wondering how your thoughts about maternal ambivalence have changed after the process of working on this book.
This is a disappointing answer, Joan. They really have not changed. Sorry.
Well, all right, one second, I do want to remind people that, so you can use the Q&A button, but you can also use the chat button if you want to contribute your question. Just wanted to give a quick shout out. If you're on a phone, if you click the more button, that usually pulls up the menu so that you can do either one. But so Sarah.
But I can say more about why.
Yes, that was where I was going to go with that. Okay.
So I did my PhD dissertation on maternal ambivalence, and one of the chapters was a phenomenological investigation into the experience of maternal ambivalence. But I worked from a variety of disciplines, so at the time it was very difficult for me to find anything. Like, I did not search maternal ambivalence and then scores of things came up for me to read. I had to just read about maternal experience and then find anything that sounded like it. And so I worked really hard to compile just evidence of what this might be, And so at the time I was not a mother. I became a mother during the time that I was writing my dissertation. But the phenomenon, I was writing about the phenomenon and researching the phenomenon before I became a mother. And so it was really based on the experiences of other women, anthropological, sociological, psychological, historical accounts of this phenomenon. And so I felt pretty solid in my research at that time. And so I don't know, I guess my literature review was thorough enough that, you know, and I was a little worried. I was like, you know, I've become a mother. I'm like, you know, am I going to think all my research is wrong? But, you know, it still seems pretty solid. And, you know, I've only had one person tell me I was wrong, and I think she just forgot. So I would tell you in confidence who this person was, because she's a very famous scholar of care ethics. So, can't say it in public. So by the time we got around to doing this book, I had already published my monograph on the topic, and had already been interrogated, you know, about it many times, and interrogated myself, and I felt pretty solid on that. So I did not change my mind about it.
We do have another question, but if there's somebody who really wants to chime in on that first one about having a change of heart as you moved through, please chime in.
It's Dan. I'd say that there was definitely more on the complexity of the topic than I had originally thought about it going into it. Right, it really unfolded before us as we worked on it, at least for me. You know, like a flower just going like, oh, there's actually all this other stuff in here, right? And so that was pretty amazing. Actually getting to think about what the topic of fatherhood encompassed from a feminist perspective, looking at it in a lot of the ways that both Sarah and Rosann have talked about, right? So the question of dads as people we consume, right? Dads as people whose behavior or appearance we consume. Obviously, that doing a lot of that sort of cultural studies stuff. Sorry. But also then looking at the subjective experience of fatherhood and paternal ambivalence, which is a thing, and starting to really understand that there are a lot of things that as parents writ large, you know, people can find in common when they look at these broader issues and this is, I think, what feminism has to teach fathers in particular, right? I think this is kind of the big crystallization for me of the book, was that what feminism has to teach me as a dad, right, has to do with what feminism has struggled with throughout its history and has had to come to terms with. Diversity is one of the things we just talked about, but also the general notion that people have a subjective experience of something that's different from how we consume it, right? Which gets back to, I mean, many books have been written about that with regard to breasts, right? To Rosann's point, right? But also that including Rosann's book, but also that subjective experience is so much more complicated, to Sarah's sort of point, than the way it gets constructed in the historical narrative, right? And so those, I mean, I'm only just picking those two because Sarah and Rosann sort of brought that up for me, but it's any one of those areas that feminism has had to interrogate and struggle with that can really change our thinking about parenting in general and about fatherhood in particular, that I think was the key thing for me about the book that I hadn't anticipated going into it. I'm sorry that took a while, but I hope that's helpful.
No, but excellent answer. So we have an anonymous person who has a question that says, you are working to have motherhood included in the definition of feminism. Is there room in your definition of feminism for conservatives?
I guess I can't sit on this, but I guess I would have to first inquire what you mean by conservative, because obviously, that term is highly socially and culturally and everywhere else constructed. Quite inquire what they mean by conservative. I'll answer without really knowing, so I don't know if that's fair. But I would answer that yes, there is a place. I mean, I think certainly at our press in Demeter, and I think generally with feminists, we don't work from rigid definition of feminism. I think there's some core beliefs we share, and that we begin with. But how feminism is lived and practiced is hugely variable, right? And and particularly with mothers, there are mothers who, certainly in the books we published and the work that I've done with mothers, who may not identify as feminist. Many of them don't, but they care deeply about mothers, and they begin with the starting point. I think we all have to begin with that starting point, at least in Demeter, that mothering is valuable, important, but it is highly devalued by our patriarchal culture. And also, I would add to that, that mothering, I think I heard it 3 times in sessions today, that mothering is a verb, right? And that it is an essentialist category, not an essentialist category. So we care about mothering as practice, and generally not exclusively, but generally it is women who do the mothering in our culture. Shouldn't be that way, doesn't need to be that way. So I'm not sure if I've answered that, but I do think, because feminism has had such a bad rap in the media, it's seen as very exclusionary. And I don't think, at least at Demeter, I think we're working from a very broad, inclusive definition of feminism and mothering, but with some shared starting points that are not negotiable.
I'd like to speak to that as well. I think, similar to Andrea, I would not presume to know what someone would mean when they said they were conservative. As a college professor, I found that oftentimes these shorthands really cannot encompass what a person really believes. And so I think that many times the underlying values that someone has are not in conflict with what mine are, regardless of what particular label they have. Sometimes the solutions that we have to the problems we care about may be different, but that's not to say that I can't learn from them and they can't learn from me. But I would never presume to know what that means to the person who's saying it. So I just would have to say yes, because I think regardless, we'd always have something to learn from each other there.
Are there other questions from our audience? So I think we might have conflicting end times on this. One is 5:30 and one's 5:45. Who knows? So we're going to aim for somewhere maybe a soft overflow over 5:30, but wrap up short of 5:45 is going to be the aim here. But the final question of this is, so if you could wave a magic wand and fix one of the problems that's in your book, what would it be and why? Yes, Sarah.
One? What happened to 3 wishes?
You can actually have more than one.
Trying to remember all the problems.
Well, is there something?
Oh, you're taking out your list. That's good.
I was going to say, I think
racism? I don't know.
we had one problem where we were critiqued for ending on a very death note in our book. So we really waved through positive, negative, and then our book ended on Chernobyl and breast cancer and death. It's a wonderful piece that the book ends on, but it is not the most uplifting of pieces. So we really tried to cap the end of the book with something positive, but I think we would have liked to have expanded on that a bit. That was really it for us. We also would have liked to have had some more Indigenous voices. We have one beautiful piece from Anishinaabe. I should be able to pronounce this properly. I'm from the region, Anishinaabe women, talking about the cultural meaning of breasts throughout the lifespan. And we would have really liked to have had, especially in light of the TRC here in Canada, to have had more Indigenous voices. So if we could have waved a magic wand and had more of that, that would have been great for us.
A problem.
So I thought the question was about the problems in the world that the book spoke
Yes,
about.
that was the initial. But
Oh,
Okay.
oh, I thought the book.
I'm like, the book's
Well,
perfect.
if I
The
could
world
wave
is
a
the
magic
problem.
wand for all the problems in the world, we would all be very happy with our breasts. And
The book
nobody
has no
would worry about
problems.
what anyone
The
else
world.
thought about them.
also,
Whoops.
but yes, originally the question came from a place of, yes, that, I mean, so many of you are trying to tackle social problems and social injustices and personal challenges and places of personal angst and struggle and political struggle. So in that sort of milieu, what sort of stood out to you is like, man, if I could just write a law, or if I could just wave a wand and fix this, I would do it tomorrow.
So for me, and this is Katie, probably not going to surprise you, but it's this problem that I have about all of the very many binaries in our society. One of which is mother, father, woman, man, right? And this idea that somehow, and obviously, I mean, it goes without saying, obviously, we are where we are. Women are doing the majority of this work that is mothering, and obviously our bodies are created in this fashion to enable the gestation and care of the newborn. But if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that everywhere would actually respect and expect paternal leave for as long as maternal leave, and that they could be stacked, because what we're seeing in countries where there are lengthy paternal leaves and where they can be stacked, so you can start with the maternal leave, which makes sense biologically, and then you go to the paternal leave next, and they are just as almost, I don't want to use the word enforced, but expected and respected, then more men are going to or whoever the non-biological other parent is, are going to have that same experience of caring for little bodies that is going to hopefully, and what we're seeing is it's true, it does change the way they interact throughout their lives. It gives the children all kinds of benefits, but it actually also gives that non-biological, you know, it's not the mother, other parent, right? Gives that person that connection with the child that I think changes that person as well. And that's what the research seems to suggest. So if we could get away from, and I understand the bitterness, yeah, it really sucks when male academics toll for a new baby and they just like pump out 5 articles because they can do that because they're not actually taking care of the new baby, right? I mean, these things really suck and there's like serious unfairness there. But if we could kind of move beyond that unfairness and just get to a place where men were actually taking care of little children, I think that a lot of these reproductions of the moms being the only ones to do all of those shifts that Andrea was talking about earlier today would actually start to disappear. So that's that, and of course, universal health care and quality child care that is subsidized for everyone. Okay.
I want to jump in.
You only
for
get
one
one,
second.
Nicole. You only get one.
I would be really curious from a standpoint of fathering, how COVID has affected that. Because I know, for example, in my own household, my partner did all of the childcare for the 6-month March break when the kids were home, did all the homeschooling, all of that. And I know a number of instances, I mean, even just anecdotally, where it was the male partner who ended up having to become the stay-at-home parent because of the pandemic. So I'd be really curious, talking about that fathering in COVID, if there's something to that, or if there's more of an effect from that. Again, just putting it out there, because I'd be very curious.
Certainly the research that I've seen has mostly talked about the fact that COVID-19 in the broader statistical sense has really been regressive for mothers and for women in general in terms of that exact question. So
yeah, and that's what I've seen as well. I was just curious if there's any flip side to that. I don't know.
I'm sure there is. I mean, you're mentioning anecdotes that you've heard, and other people I'm seeing other panelists nodding vigorously or commenting in the chat, as Sarah, I think, is. So I think I think the answer is that the story is probably more complicated than what we're seeing in the initial data.
I think so too. I think so too. Now,
or-
bearing in mind for me, I'm a nurse, so a healthcare provider, so it may be very different for healthcare providers
Well,
and their partners during COVID.
that's what I was going
Um,
to say, is that it may
yeah.
depend on who you are and where you're at.
Exactly.
What their story is.
Exactly.
But what I think that the pandemic has done, that I have seen a lot of, is although yes, it does reinforce these broader sort of social injustices, for want of a better word, whether they are along lines of race, class, or gender, or whatever. It also has opened up possibilities for things to happen that have not historically happened. And so I think in cases where you're in a family that has heterosexual partnership, where the male partner can do more of the childcare, or where, as in your case, there would be a more natural progression to that. I think like I say, it's just opened up some possibilities for things that actually fit better with Nicole's version of how things ought to be, than was historically possible before. Now, is that only in circumstances, where people have a certain means or a certain level of stability or come from a certain kind of background? The data is going to be more complicated. We're going to be looking at it for the next century, for sure.
And Andrea, would you like to steer us out